The U.S. Senate is bracing for another government shutdown next month, and the debate over health insurance subsidies are again taking center stage. Last week, the Senate failed to advance competing Democratic and Republican health care proposals. This week, the House is set to debate the issue with possible votes coming on Wednesday. The Hill senior staff writer Alexander Bolton joins us to discuss. Hey, Alex, so is there any hope for a bipartisan compromise before lawmakers leave town for the holiday? And if they don't get something done, how do you see this issue playing out in the new year?
It's very unlikely lawmakers reach a bipartisan deal on extending the expiring Affordable Care Act's health insurance premium subsidies. Barring President Trump stepping in the next few days and essentially directing Republicans to strike a deal with Democrats to extend the subsidies for 1 or 2 years, there's not going to be a deal. At this point, there might be around a half dozen Republican senators who'd be willing to vote for an extension of the ACA subsidies, but that's not enough to get it through the Senate. You need 60 votes to pass it through the Senate. That means you need at least 13 Republicans. Right now, I think at most you have about half that. Unless President Trump were to step in and tell Republicans to cut a deal to take this issue off the table and to avert health insurance premiums raising or increasing by double digits next year. People who get the subsidies, the enhanced subsidies that are expiring, if those are allowed to expire, they could see their health insurance premiums more than double. So this is a big issue, but Republicans are so ideologically opposed to extending the ACA subsidies that without President Trump giving them political cover, they're not going to agree to anything that the Democrats would agree to as well.
So if we look back to the shutdown, Democrats did not extract concessions, concrete concessions from Republicans during what was a record-long shutdown back in October and November. But they did draw attention to the healthcare issue, and now Republicans are in sort of a difficult position here. Do Democrats think their shutdown strategy, looking back on it now, worked the first time, and so maybe they'll try it again at the end of January if nothing happens with those subsidies between now and then?
They saw the shutdown strategy as very successful for a number of reasons. Number one, it put the healthcare issue, the rising healthcare premiums, front and center, made it a top issue for 2026. Also, effectively, and this is something that even Republicans concede, it put the blame on Republicans for these rising health insurance premiums. And that is something that even Republicans acknowledge. It was an effective communication strategy. They did get a small concession. They got Republicans to agree to a vote on extending the ACA subsidies, and that vote happened on Thursday. You had 4 Republicans vote for it. So there are a number of defectors in the Senate GOP conference. Also on the House side, you have about between 9 and a dozen Republicans who have signed discharge petitions to force this issue to the floor. So the Democrats have momentum here. And what we saw in the polls is that more Americans blamed Republicans for shutdown than Democrats for the shutdown, even though it was the Democrats who triggered it, who blocked the funding bills. And what we also saw is that President Trump's approval rating dipped during the shutdown. It's since bounced back a little bit. And we saw the Democrats increase their lead on the generic ballot for Congress. So they did better in the polls. They got their number one issue in the spotlight. And they got Republicans to, get the public blame for the shutdown. So it was very successful. So that is why there are Democrats now who are looking ahead to this January 30th deadline, and they want to play it again. They thought it worked quite well.
I understand Republicans are ideologically opposed to the Affordable Care Act, but during the Trump era, it's not like Republicans have been, it's not been uncommon for them to go places that they probably wouldn't have gone during previous eras. Why don't Republicans just coalesce, go on offense around a package that includes some conservative healthcare reforms, but also an extension of those subsidies with new limitations, and then force Democrats to be the ones taking difficult votes?
You think they do that because that would be the logical next step forward. And the question is, why aren't they? And I think part of the problem is that this is such a charged issue. I mean, let's think back in history a little bit. The Tea Party, which is in many ways what the modern Republican Party has become, this kind of Tea Party populist party, that Tea Party movement got its start. It had its genesis in the public backlash to Obamacare back in the summer of 2009. I remember it well, and So it just explains that this opposition to Obamacare is deeply entwined in the DNA of the modern Republican Party. And that is why they are so loath to agree to an extension of the ACA subsidies, even if they were to tack on conservative reforms like setting up health savings accounts or, for instance, capping the income on who's eligible for these enhanced subsidies, or, for instance, requiring lower income Americans to pay at minimum a $25 a month premium. So there are some reforms out there. Yes, you lay it out very nicely. It seems like there's a deal to be had, but there just isn't the political will to do it. And that's why you need President Trump to provide the political cover here. As I mentioned, opposition to Obamacare. Dick Durbin, the Senate Democratic whip, he made a joke on the Senate floor last week. He said Republicans hate Obamacare like the devil hates holy water. Well, that's kind of his that's his way of putting it. But he does get at a truth here. I mean, there is a deep animosity, antipathy within the Republican Party to anything related to Obamacare. But Trump can step in though and solve this by saying, "Look, guys, we need to get this done, and we need to extend these subsidies at least for a short while. Otherwise, we're going to get killed in the 2026 midterm election."
This Democratic shutdown strategy, you write in your piece, hinges to a certain extent on whether a package of appropriations bills passes before government funding runs out. Can you explain that dynamic?
Well, so let's keep in mind there's something else that gives Democrats a pretty big advantage here, which is that as part of the deal to reopen the government, they passed a package of three bills funding departments of agriculture, military construction, veterans affairs, and the legislative branch. So if there is another shutdown in February, what's going to be different is because a few of these spending bills have already passed, SNAP benefits are not going to be affected. And I think that's where the Democrats felt the most political pain in the fall, is because low income Americans were losing, or people who need food assistance, not just low income Americans, they were losing their SNAP benefits. And, as John Fetterman, the maverick Democrat from Pennsylvania, said, that is just a core, democratic value to make sure that people who are hungry get food and the federal government's there to provide for them. And I think that put a lot of pressure on the Democrats to agree to reopen the government. Now the SNAP benefits have been funded through fiscal year 2026. So there is, I think, less of a pain point for the Democrats if there is another shutdown. But now the question is, going back to your question, what are the other elements of government that may be funded by the January 30th deadline? And what you have right now is the Republican leadership, particularly John Thune, the Senate Majority Leader. He's trying to get a package of 5 spending bills passed. That would include Department of Defense, Department of Labor, Department of Health and Human Services, Department of Education, Department of Commerce, Department of Justice, Department of State. And so what Thune's trying to do is get this package of 5 appropriations bills passed next month. Democrats want to pass these bills. They would allow them to essentially, reset, programmatic spending, make updates to federal programs. Democrats like passing appropriations bills. If that package passes, then you have about 85% to 90% of the federal government funded, and a shutdown doesn't have that much impact. So that is why Thune and the Republican leadership, at least on the Senate side, is very insistent on pushing this package of regular appropriations bills to try to get most of government funded and take shutdown off the table. The problem is they're facing a conservative rebellion. There are a number of conservatives who are holding up this package because they don't like all the earmarks in it. They don't like the fact that it's gotten so big. It includes 5 bills. They don't like the fact that it has some authorizing language, which affects the committees they're on. So it's a complicated brew. But the bottom line is, I think the Republican leadership wants to get government funded before the next funding deadline, so the Democrats don't trigger another shutdown. The question is, do they have the ability to do it? Can they deliver? Can they get through the obstruction and the obstacles that are being thrown up within their own conference?
Let's game this out a little bit into next year. So say these subsidies expire, people's health premiums shoot way up. You have a looming government shutdown based on, the potency of which we'll have to see if any of those appropriations bills pass. Then you have the midterms coming up. What do you think the chances are that Republicans end up trying to pass healthcare reform through a reconciliation package so they can circumvent Democrats and maybe try to take healthcare off the table as a burden for the GOP heading into those midterm elections?
That's really a triple bank shot. Republicans haven't had a lot of success at all in passing healthcare legislation. And, we remember in 2017, during Trump's first term, they weren't able to pass the Obamacare repeal, even though there was strong consensus, within the Republican Party, at least theoretically on paper, that they wanted to repeal it. They couldn't deliver the votes. They just don't have a great track record. Going back to when President George W. Bush passed the Medicare Part D expansion, which covered prescription drug costs under Medicare, that really divided the party. So you ask about reconciliation. Yes, that's been floated. In fact, that's been proposed. The problem is the majorities are so narrow in the House and the Senate that the leadership views it as impractical. It's a pipe dream. They just think it's a fantasy to try to pass something in legislation on a big issue that has historically divided the Republican Party through reconciliation, when there are so many divisions and the majorities are so narrow in both the House and the Senate. And as you know, reconciliation, when you do the reconciliation process, what you're doing is you're circumventing the 60 vote threshold in the Senate. You're circumventing the filibuster. It becomes a very partisan exercise. So you will not get any Democratic votes, whereas you might otherwise. If you try to bring a healthcare bill outside the reconciliation process, you might get some Democratic votes for it. Reconciliation, completely partisan. You won't get any Democratic votes. That means you need to have your conferences entirely unified in both the House and the Senate to have any hope of getting this done. And Republicans just aren't unified on healthcare. They haven't been for decades, and nothing's going to change in the next month. So that's why the leadership has really pushed back on that idea of moving reconciliation moving healthcare reform through reconciliation. As I said, what is the game changer here? Only one person can do it: Donald Trump. Donald Trump tells these guys, cut a deal, extend these subsidies, take the issue off the table. It's good politics. They will line up behind him like the Pied Piper of Hamelin and get it done.
All right. Well, it will be very interesting and, of course, very consequential watching this debate go through the rest of the year and into the new year. We'll leave it at that for now. Alexander Bolton, always great to have your insight. Thank you for taking the time.
Thanks for having me on.